Imagine standing at the edge of a golden wheat field at sunrise. The air is still. Birds are singing somewhere in the distance. The crop stretches all the way to the horizon, row after row of green and amber, swaying gently like a slow tide coming in. It looks peaceful. It looks safe. But right now, at this very moment, something is happening inside that field that the farmer cannot see. Something so small that 100 of them could fit on the tip of your finger. Something that, given enough time and the right conditions, could reduce every single plant in this field to a dry, lifeless husk. The farmer worked for months to get here. He planted the seeds in carefully prepared soil, watched the weather every single day, and prayed for rain at just the right moments. His entire year, his family's income, his mortgage, his children's school fees is standing right here in this field. And the enemy is already inside it. Today, we are going to follow that invisible enemy. We are going to get down beneath the leaves, into the soil, onto the stems, and discover the tiny insect that has brought civilizations to their knees, triggered famines that killed millions, and continues today to challenge every farmer on Earth. No matter how advanced their equipment, no matter how expensive their chemicals, no matter how carefully they watch. This is the story of the aphid, and nothing about it is small. Before we even talk about what an aphid is, let us understand what a farm actually is. Most people picture a farm the way a child draws it, a red barn, a few cows, a smiling sun overhead. But a working farm is something else entirely. It is a living system, as complex and balanced as any ecosystem on the planet. There are thousands of species of insects, fungi, bacteria, and microorganisms living in and around every crop field. Most of them are invisible to the naked eye. Most of them are either neutral or beneficial. They decompose organic matter, pollinate flowers, and control each other's populations in a delicate web of predator and prey. It is, if you think about it, a battlefield with a fragile truce. And when that truce breaks, when one species finds a gap in the defenses and begins to multiply faster than its predators can control it, the entire system can collapse with shocking speed. This is the world aphids live in, and they are very, very good at exploiting it. Let us start small. Let us start where everything starts, with the insect itself. An aphid, seen under a magnifying glass for the first time, is a strange and unsettling creature. Most species are between 1 and 4 millimeters long. That is roughly the size of a pinhead. They are soft-bodied, pear-shaped, and come in colors that range from pale green to yellow to black to red, depending on the species and the plant they are feeding on. Their legs are thin as threads. Their antennae wave constantly, detecting the chemistry of the world around them. There are approximately 5,000 known species of aphids in the world. 5,000. And while most people have heard the name, very few people truly understand what makes aphids so uniquely dangerous. It is not their size. It is not their bite. It is not even their numbers, though their numbers are extraordinary. It is their biology. Their method of reproduction is one of the most remarkable and devastating in the entire insect world. And to understand it, we need to understand something that sounds almost like science fiction. For most of the year, every aphid you will ever see on a plant is female. Not just mostly female, not predominantly female, every single one is female. And these females do not need to mate. They do not need a male aphid anywhere nearby. Instead, they reproduce by a process called parthenogenesis, which sounds complicated, but the concept is simple. The female gives birth to live young, already formed, miniature aphids, who are themselves already pregnant. The daughters are born carrying their own daughters inside them, like a set of living Russian nesting dolls. Think about what that means for a moment. A single aphid landing on a healthy plant on a warm spring morning can, within a week, begin producing 5 to 10 offspring every single day. Those offspring reach reproductive maturity in just 7 to 10 days. They then begin producing their own offspring at the same rate, and those offspring begin producing offspring. Within 1 month, under ideal conditions, a single aphid can become a colony of thousands. Within 2 months, that colony can become hundreds of thousands. Mathematicians who have tried to calculate the theoretical maximum population from a single aphid ancestor, if every offspring survived and reproduced without limit, have arrived at numbers so large they barely have meaning, enough aphids to cover the surface of the earth, stacked several layers deep. Of course, that never happens. Nature does not allow it, but understanding that potential gives you a sense of what a farmer is actually dealing with when the first signs of an aphid colony appear. Time is everything, and aphids are masters of time. Now let us go back to that wheat field. Let us follow one aphid, a single pioneer, and watch what she does. It is early spring. The wheat has just emerged from the ground in thin, bright green lines. The air is warming. Temperatures are climbing past 15 degrees Celsius, which is the point at which aphids become truly active. Our aphid was born just days ago, probably on a nearby weed or perhaps on a winter host plant where the colony spent the colder months. She is winged. Not all aphids develop wings. Whether they do depends on conditions we will talk about shortly. But this one has wings and she uses them. She lifts off and flies. Aphids are not strong flyers. They cannot fight a wind or navigate with any precision. They are, in a sense, passengers. They drift on air currents carried by the breeze, sometimes for only a few meters and sometimes for hundreds of kilometers, depending on the wind. Scientists have found aphids at altitudes of several thousand meters, floating above the clouds, suspended in airstreams that can carry them across entire countries. But eventually, she descends, and the way she finds a host plant is remarkable. She uses chemistry. Plants are constantly releasing invisible chemical compounds into the air, a language of signals that most creatures cannot read, but aphids can. Different plants release different chemical signatures, and different aphid species are tuned to detect specific ones. Our wheat aphid is following a trail of scent that leads her down through the air toward a young wheat shoot, soft and green, and full of the sugary sap she needs to survive. She lands. She pauses. She tastes the surface of the leaf with her feet, because aphid feet actually have taste receptors, able to confirm she is on the right plant before committing to feed. Satisfied, she inserts her mouthparts into the leaf, and this is where the story becomes deeply fascinating. An aphid does not bite, it does not chew, it does not tear or cut. Instead, it probes. An aphid's mouthpart is called a stylet, a structure so thin it is nearly invisible to the naked eye, more like a hypodermic needle than anything we would ordinarily call a mouth. The aphid does not push this stylet through plant cells the way a needle pushes through skin. Instead, it navigates between cells, finding the microscopic gaps and passageways, threading its way deeper and deeper into the plant tissue with extraordinary precision. The destination is the phloem. If you think of a plant as a living body, the phloem is its bloodstream, a network of tiny tubes that carry sugary, nutrient-rich fluid called phloem sap from the leaves, where photosynthesis produces it, to every other part of the plant that needs energy. When the aphid reaches the phloem, it does something clever. It releases saliva into the tube. This saliva contains chemicals that suppress the plant's natural defensive response, because plants do have defenses, and we will talk about those shortly. For now, the saliva acts like a kind of chemical sedative, keeping the plant's immune system quiet while the aphid settles in to feed. Then the aphid simply drinks. The phloem sap is under natural pressure inside the plant, so the aphid does not even need to suck hard. The sap flows into its body almost on its own. And the aphid feeds, and feeds, and feeds. But here is something that surprises most people when they first hear it. The damage aphids do is not primarily about the sap they steal. A single aphid drinking phloem sap is not going to kill a plant. Even a small colony will not drain a plant dry. Plants produce far more sap than one colony of insects can consume. The real damage comes from several other things, and each one is more serious than the last. The first is the waste product. When an aphid feeds on phloem sap, it is processing enormous amounts of sugar-rich fluid. The aphid can only use some of that sugar for energy. The rest passes through its body and exits as a sticky, sugary liquid called honeydew. Under a heavy aphid infestation, leaves become coated in this honeydew. You may have seen it without knowing what it was. If you have ever parked your car under a tree in summer and come back to find it covered in a mysterious sticky film, that was very likely aphid honeydew dripping from the leaves above. On a plant, this honeydew creates the perfect growing medium for a fungus called sooty mold. The mold itself does not attack the plant, but it coats the leaves in a black, dusty layer that blocks sunlight. And sunlight is what the plant uses to produce energy through photosynthesis. Cover a leaf in black mold, and you have, in effect, switched off the plant's power supply for that section. But the honeydew creates another problem too. It attracts ants. Ants and aphids have one of the most extraordinary relationships in the insect world. A partnership so sophisticated that scientists have compared it to farming. Certain species of ants actively seek out aphid colonies. They feed on the honeydew, which is a rich source of sugar, and in exchange they protect the aphids. If a predator, a ladybird, a parasitic wasp, a lacewing larva approaches the aphid colony, the ants drive it away. They patrol constantly, moving around the colony like tiny security guards. But the relationship goes even further. Some ant species actually move aphid eggs underground during winter to protect them from the cold, and bring the newly hatched aphids back up to plants in spring. Some ant species have been observed carrying live aphids from one plant to another, essentially placing their food source on fresh, more productive hosts. And in some species of aphids, the insects have evolved to produce specific chemical signals that trigger caring behavior in ants, a pheromone that acts like a command. Protect me. It is an ancient alliance. Fossil evidence suggests it has been going on for at least 40 million years. And for the farmer watching ant trails running up and down the stems of his crop plants, it is a sign that an aphid colony is being actively defended. The enemy has reinforcements. But we said the sap theft and the honeydew were not the worst things. They are not. The worst thing aphids do is something entirely invisible, something that does not show up until it is too late, something that has caused more crop destruction in human history than almost any other biological force. Aphids are vectors. A vector, in the biological sense, is an organism that carries disease from one living thing to another. You may have heard this word in relation to mosquitoes, which are vectors for malaria and dengue fever. But aphids are vectors too, and for plants, the diseases they carry are catastrophic. When an aphid probes a plant with its stylet, remember, it is navigating between cells, exploring the tissue before it settles to feed. It may pick up microscopic pathogens along the way. Viruses, in particular, are extremely small and can attach to an aphid's mouthparts or saliva during feeding. When that aphid moves to a new plant and begins probing again, those pathogens transfer. Plant viruses transmitted by aphids include some of the most destructive diseases in modern agriculture. Barley yellow dwarf virus, transmitted by aphids, is considered one of the most economically damaging cereal crop diseases in the world, affecting wheat, barley, oats, and dozens of other grass species across every continent except Antarctica. Potato virus Y, transmitted by aphids, devastates potato crops globally. Cucumber mosaic virus, beet western yellows, plum pox virus. The list is very long, and behind every name on that list is a history of failed harvests and desperate farmers. The truly frightening thing about aphids as viral vectors is this. An aphid does not need to stay on a plant for long to transmit a virus. Some viruses transfer in a matter of seconds during that initial probing phase, before the aphid even decides whether to settle and feed. This means an aphid can land on a plant, taste it, decide it is not a suitable host, fly away, and leave a lethal infection behind in the process. The plant shows no symptoms for days or even weeks. By the time the yellowing leaves and stunted growth reveal what has happened, the aphid that caused it is long gone, and the virus is already spreading to the plants around it. We should pause here and ask a question that every farmer asks. Why does nature produce something this destructive? It is a fair question, and the answer, as with so many things in ecology, is complicated. Aphids did not evolve to destroy farms. Farms are a human invention, a historical eye blink in the long story of life on Earth. Aphids evolved over tens of millions of years in natural ecosystems where they fed on wild plants, contributed to food webs, and were kept in check by a long list of natural predators. They are, in those natural systems, a useful link in the chain, a way of converting plant sap into protein that becomes food for insects, birds, bats, and everything that feeds on them. The problem began when humans created monocultures. A monoculture is what a modern farm essentially is, a vast area of land covered entirely by one species of plant. Before human agriculture, this almost never happened in nature. Wild landscapes were diverse, filled with dozens or hundreds of plant species growing together, which meant that even if an aphid population exploded on one species, it was contained by the simple fact that its preferred host plant was surrounded by plants it did not want to eat. A wheat field gives aphids no such barriers. The host plant stretches for kilometers in every direction. The conditions are perfect, and with no natural predators present in the same numbers that a natural ecosystem would provide, aphid populations can build unchecked until the damage becomes severe. Understanding this does not solve the problem, but it helps explain why the solution has to be more nuanced than simply spraying everything in sight. And farmers have certainly tried spraying. The history of chemical pest control is a fascinating and deeply troubled story that runs parallel to the history of modern agriculture. In the early 20th century, as farms grew larger and more mechanized, the need to control pests at scale led to the development of synthetic pesticides. By the mid-century, chemicals like DDT were being promoted as miracle solutions, total pest elimination at the press of a lever. DDT worked. In a brutal, indiscriminate way, it worked spectacularly. Spray a field and nearly every insect in it dies. Aphids, yes, but also the beetles, the wasps, the lacewings, the hoverflies, all the predators that were naturally keeping aphid populations in check. And here is the problem with removing predators. When DDT is sprayed and everything dies, the field is briefly clean. But then spring comes again, and the first insects to recolonize a dead field are almost always the ones that reproduce fastest, because nature will always reward fast reproducers when space and resources suddenly become available. Which insect reproduces faster than almost anything else? The aphid. By destroying the predators that controlled aphids, early pesticide use actually made aphid problems worse over time. Farmers sprayed more. Resistance developed because evolution never stops, and within a population of thousands of aphids, there will always be a few individuals with a slight genetic advantage in tolerating a particular chemical. Those individuals survive. They reproduce. Their offspring inherit the resistance. Within a few generations, the entire colony is resistant. Aphids, with their extraordinarily rapid reproductive cycle, can develop resistance to a new pesticide within just a few seasons. This is not a slow process. This is evolution happening in real time, right in front of us on a farm near you. But nature did not leave farmers without allies. Step away from the chemistry for a moment and look closer at the plant itself, because plants are not passive victims in this story. They are fighting back, and the way they fight is one of the most remarkable stories in biology. When an aphid begins to feed on a plant, when that stylet first penetrates the leaf tissue, the plant detects it. Not with nerves, not with anything like pain in the way we experience it, but through chemical signals. Damage to plant cells triggers the release of compounds called jasmonic acid and salicylic acid, which travel through the plant's vascular system like an alarm message. When these signals reach other parts of the plant, they trigger the production of defensive proteins, compounds that interfere with aphid digestion, that make the sap less nutritious, that essentially begin to make the plant less hospitable to the insect feeding on it. But the plant does something even more remarkable. Some plant species respond to aphid attack by releasing volatile compounds into the air, airborne chemical signals that neighboring plants can detect. These signals cause the neighboring plants to begin their own defensive preparations before any aphid has even reached them. Scientists call this plant-to-plant communication, and while the mechanisms are still being studied and debated, the evidence that it exists is now very strong. A plant under aphid attack is, in a sense, calling for help, sending a chemical message outward that says, "Prepare yourselves." But the most extraordinary part of this story is not the message to other plants. It is a different message entirely, one aimed at a very specific audience. When certain plants are attacked by aphids, the volatile compounds they release into the air are not random. Research has shown that some plants release a very specific blend of chemicals that is, in effect, a distress call targeted at aphids' natural enemies. Parasitic wasps, tiny creatures, many of them a millimeter or less in size, use these plant-released signals to locate aphid colonies. The wasp flies toward the scent, finds the colony and lands. Then it does something that sounds like it belongs in a horror film. The wasp stings an aphid, not to kill it, at least not immediately. Instead, the wasp deposits a single egg inside the living aphid's body. The aphid continues to feed. It continues to move. It continues from the outside to look entirely normal. But inside it, an egg has hatched. A wasp larva is developing, feeding on the aphid's internal tissues in a carefully calibrated way, consuming the non-essential parts first, keeping the aphid alive as long as possible, because a living aphid is fresher and better food than a dead one. Only when the larva is fully developed and ready to pupate does it consume the remaining vital organs and kill its host. The aphid's body, now hollowed out, becomes a golden brown, swollen shell called a mummy. Inside it, the young wasp completes its development, eventually chewing a small hole and emerging to find another aphid colony. A single parasitic wasp can parasitize hundreds of aphids in its lifetime. And remember, the plant called it there. There are other predators too. The ladybird or ladybug, depending on where you are in the world, is perhaps the most famous aphid predator. A single adult ladybird can eat between 50 and 300 aphids per day. Its larvae are even more voracious, consuming hundreds of aphids over the course of their development. A ladybird population in a field is, in effect, a biological pest control system operating around the clock at no cost to the farmer. Lacewings, delicate, gauze-winged insects that most people have seen without ever noticing, are equally important. Their larvae are sometimes called aphid lions, and the name is well-deserved. The lacewing larva has long, curved mandibles designed specifically for seizing aphids and sucking out their contents. They move through aphid colonies like tiny, relentless predators. Hoverflies lay their eggs near aphid colonies, and their larvae feed on aphids for weeks before pupating. Parasitic midges, spiders, predatory beetles, earwigs, ground beetles. The list of creatures that feed on aphids is genuinely long. In a healthy, diverse ecosystem, These predators together can prevent aphid populations from ever reaching damaging levels. The tragedy of modern agriculture is that we spent several decades actively destroying this system with broad-spectrum pesticides before we understood what we were losing. The good news, and there is good news, is that we are learning. The science of integrated pest management, or IPM, emerged in the second half of the 20th century as scientists and farmers began to understand what blanket pesticide use was doing to the broader ecosystem. IPM is not about abandoning pest control. It is about understanding the enemy well enough to fight it surgically rather than with a blunt instrument. In an IPM system, the farmer does not spray the moment any aphids appear. Instead, he monitors. He walks the field regularly, checking plants, counting aphids, watching for signs of natural predators. He understands that a small aphid population in a field with healthy predator numbers is not necessarily a crisis. It may be a crisis in the making, or it may simply be the normal background level that a healthy field can absorb. The farmer sets a threshold, an economic damage level, below which he accepts some aphid presence as part of the system. Above that threshold, he acts, and when he acts, he chooses the least disruptive intervention first. This might mean introducing commercially raised populations of ladybirds or parasitic wasps into the field. It might mean using selective insecticides that target aphids specifically without killing beneficial insects. It might mean planting flowering plants around the edges of the field, called insectary strips, that provide nectar and pollen for the natural enemies of aphids, keeping those predator populations high and well-fed, even when prey is temporarily scarce. It is farming as ecology rather than farming as warfare. And in trial after trial around the world, it has been shown to be more effective and more sustainable than the chemical approach alone. But we should not pretend that IPM solves everything, because aphids have one more trick, one more biological adaptation that seems almost impossibly clever. Remember, we said that not all aphids have wings. Whether an aphid develops wings depends on environmental cues, signals the colony picks up from its surroundings. When food is plentiful and the colony is not too crowded, most aphids are born wingless. They are more energy efficient that way, putting all their resources into reproduction rather than flight. But when the colony becomes too large, when the plant begins to show stress, when days shorten and temperatures drop, the colony receives signals, and in response, it begins producing winged individuals. Not random members of the colony, but a specific type of aphid, morphologically different from its wingless sisters, built for dispersal. These winged aphids lift off and scatter. They are the pioneers, the colonizers, the insurance policy. Even if a predator or a farmer destroys the colony they came from, these dispersers are already elsewhere, finding new plants, starting new colonies, carrying the population forward. And in autumn, when the season truly ends, something else happens. Aphids begin to produce sexual forms, actual males and females, for the first time in the year. These mate and the females produce a type of egg unlike the live young produced all summer. These eggs are tough, cold-resistant, able to survive winter temperatures that would kill any living aphid. They are tucked into bark crevices, soil, the stems of woody plants waiting. In spring they hatch, and the whole story begins again. Let us talk about numbers, because it is impossible to fully appreciate what aphids mean for human civilization without confronting the scale of what they cost. Global crop losses to aphids and the viruses they carry are estimated in the hundreds of billions of dollars annually. Not millions, hundreds of billions. Some estimates for specific crop diseases transmitted by aphids run into the tens of billions for a single disease in a single year. In parts of Africa and Asia, where small-scale farmers have fewer resources to respond to outbreaks, a severe aphid infestation can mean the difference between feeding a family and going hungry. The food security implications are direct and deadly. The Irish potato famine of the 1840s, perhaps the most famous agricultural disaster in Western history, which killed approximately 1 million people and caused the emigration of another million, was caused by a water mold, not an aphid. But the barley yellow dwarf virus, carried by aphids, has contributed to documented crop failures across sub-Saharan Africa that have affected the food supply of millions of people. These are not abstract statistics. Behind every percentage point of crop loss, there are farmers watching their fields fail. There are children eating less. There are communities that do not recover. And the aphid, of course, does not know any of this. It is simply doing what its biology has made it to do, finding food, surviving, reproducing. The tragedy and the crisis are entirely on our side. One of the most remarkable chapters in this story takes place not in a field, but in a laboratory. Because scientists, confronted with an enemy that evolves faster than our chemicals can target it, have begun thinking about the problem in a completely different way. Genetic research into aphids has uncovered some truly extraordinary findings. For one thing, scientists discovered that some aphid species carry bacteria inside their own cells, bacteria called Buchnera aphidicola, that have been living inside aphids for approximately 200 million years. These bacteria have co-evolved with aphids so completely that they can no longer survive outside an aphid's body, and the aphids, in return, cannot survive without them. The bacteria produce essential amino acids, the building blocks of protein, that aphids cannot make themselves and cannot get in sufficient quantities from phloem sap. Two species, locked together for 200 million years, neither able to exist without the other. But here is why this matters for pest control. If scientists can find a way to disrupt the relationship between aphids and their internal bacteria, the aphids lose their ability to survive on plant sap. The bacteria become a vulnerability, a target that, if carefully approached, could offer a way to control aphids without affecting any other species. Research is ongoing. The science is complicated, but the principle is promising. Other research has looked at the aphid's olfactory system, its ability to smell. Aphids use pheromones extensively to communicate within colonies. One particularly important pheromone is the alarm signal, a chemical called EBF, or beta-farnesene, which aphids release when disturbed or attacked. Other aphids in the colony detect this signal and scatter, which makes sense as a survival strategy, but also disrupts feeding and reproduction. Researchers have experimented with spraying synthetic EBF on crop fields, essentially creating a constant false alarm that keeps aphids in a perpetual state of disturbance. Stressed aphids feed less, reproduce less, and are more likely to leave. In field trials, this approach has shown real promise. Plants themselves have been genetically modified in some research programs to produce EBF continuously, keeping the aphids off balance simply by smelling like danger. The ethical and practical debates around GM crops are complex and ongoing, but the scientific ingenuity behind the approach is genuinely impressive. There is another dimension to this story that is easy to overlook, a human dimension. Let us spend a moment with the farmers. In the great grain belts of North America, the wheat and corn farmers of Kansas and Nebraska and the Dakotas check their fields every morning. Some of them are third or fourth generation farmers on the same land. They carry knowledge passed down across decades, knowledge about which years the aphids came early, which sprays worked and which did not, where the ladybirds were most plentiful, which corner of the field always seems to get hit first. This knowledge, informal, empirical, practical, sits alongside the scientific literature, in a way that agricultural researchers have increasingly come to respect. Citizen science programs in several countries now involve farmers in systematic aphid monitoring, contributing data from thousands of fields simultaneously. This kind of distributed data collection, impossible for a research station alone, is helping scientists map aphid population dynamics across entire continents. In sub-Saharan Africa, extension workers, agricultural advisors who travel between villages teaching farmers about pest management, have become crucial frontline responders in aphid outbreaks. Teaching a farmer to recognize the early signs of an aphid colony, to understand the difference between a manageable infestation and one that requires intervention, can literally save a harvest. In South Asia, where rice aphids affect one of the world's most critical food crops, researchers and NGOs work together to help small-scale farmers access affordable biological controls that were previously only available to large commercial operations. The fight against aphids is not just a scientific problem. It is a social, economic, and humanitarian one. And the solutions that work best are the ones that put knowledge directly into the hands of the people standing in the field. Let us go back to that wheat field one more time. Let us visit it later in the season. It is midsummer now. The wheat has grown tall, heavy heads nodding in the breeze. But if you look carefully at the lower leaves bending down, getting close, you will see them. Clusters of tiny green bodies crowded together along the stems and undersides of leaves. Aphids. A colony has established itself. The farmer found them 3 days ago on his morning walk. He counted them section by section, plot by plot. He noted how many beneficial insects he could see. He consulted the current weather forecast. A warm, humid week ahead would favor aphid reproduction, while a cold front could slow them significantly. He made a decision. Not to spray. Not yet. The population is below the economic threshold. The parasitic wasp population in this field is strong. He can already see the brown mummies scattered through the colony, each one a wasp nursery, each one a future predator. The insectary strip he planted last year along the southern edge of the field is bright with flowers, and hoverflies are moving across it in the late afternoon sun. He will check again in 3 days. He is not passive. He is watching. He is waiting. He understands that the field is not his alone, that it is a system, a community of living things, and that his job is not to control every creature in it but to tip the balance in his favor when it matters. This is what modern, informed farming looks like. It is not glamorous. It is not dramatic. It is quiet, patient, observant stewardship of a living system. And it is the approach that is slowly, carefully, one field at a time, shifting the odds. Perhaps the most humbling thing about this whole story is how long it has been going on. Aphids and plants have been at war for over 300 million years, long before there were farmers, long before there were humans, long before there were mammals of any kind on Earth. In the great Carboniferous swamps, when the planet was covered in vast, warm forests of giant ferns and primitive trees, aphid-like insects were already probing the vascular systems of plants, and plants were already evolving defenses against them. The relationship between insects and plants, this intricate, long-running negotiation of attack and defense, exploitation and adaptation, has shaped the biology of every plant and insect alive today. Every defense a plant has, every chemical trick it can deploy, was hammered out across hundreds of millions of years of this contest. Every exploitation strategy an aphid uses is the product of the same long refinement. We arrived late to this battle. We drew lines on the land, planted our crops in rows, and suddenly found ourselves in the middle of a very old war with no understanding of the combatants and no map of the terrain. The history of pest control is, in many ways, the story of humans slowly, often painfully learning the rules of a game that was already ancient when we joined it. We are getting better at learning. Remote sensing technology, satellites and drones equipped with cameras sensitive to specific wavelengths of light, can now detect the stress signatures of aphid-damaged crops before the damage is visible to the naked eye. Chlorophyll fluorescence, water stress indicators, changes in the spectral profile of plant leaves. These are signals that a satellite passing over a field can detect, that can be processed by artificial intelligence, and flagged to a farmer's phone as a probable aphid hotspot requiring investigation. This is not science fiction. This technology exists today and is being deployed in large-scale farming operations across Europe, North America, and Australia. Machine learning systems trained on thousands of images of aphid infestations at different stages can now, from a photograph taken on a smartphone, identify the species of aphid present, estimate the density of the colony, and recommend a course of action. Agronomic apps available to any farmer with a smartphone are bringing this capability to small-scale farmers in developing countries at low or no cost. Precision agriculture, the use of GPS-guided equipment to apply pesticides or biological controls only in the specific zones of a field where they are needed, rather than treating the whole field uniformly, is dramatically reducing the amount of chemical used while increasing effectiveness. Spray the 10% of the field where the aphids are concentrated rather than the whole thing. Protect the beneficial insect populations in the rest of the field. Target the problem. Spare the ecosystem. It is a long way from the blanket DDT spraying of the 1950s, and the direction of travel is genuinely hopeful. But the aphid is not standing still. Climate change is already beginning to alter the geography and timing of aphid outbreaks. Warmer winters mean that aphid eggs survive more easily, and populations emerge in spring in higher numbers. Warmer springs mean that the window of rapid reproduction begins earlier, giving colonies more time to build before beneficial insects arrive in sufficient numbers to control them. Range expansions are documented. Species of aphids that were once limited to certain climates are being found in new regions as temperatures rise. The interaction between climate change and aphid biology is an active and urgent area of research. Scientists are modeling how aphid population dynamics may shift over the coming decades under different climate scenarios. The projections in some regions are concerning. Areas that currently have manageable aphid pressure may see it intensify. Crops that are currently protected by climate, the natural cold that limits aphid activity, may lose that protection. The arms race continues, and the battlefield is changing. There is a detail in this story that feels, to those of us who stop to consider it, almost like a parable. The aphid, this tiny, soft-bodied, almost transparent creature, has survived every mass extinction event in the past 300 million years. It survived the asteroid that killed the dinosaurs. It survived the Great Dying at the end of the Permian period, when approximately 90% of all marine species and 70% of all terrestrial species were wiped from the Earth. It has outlasted creatures of incomparably greater size, complexity, and apparent power. It survived because of flexibility, because of rapid reproduction, because of genetic diversity, because of the ability to adapt faster than its environment could change. We are clever creatures. We have developed chemistry, genetics, satellite imaging, artificial intelligence. We have brought extraordinary resources to bear on this problem. And yet here is the honest truth. We have not beaten the aphid. We have learned to manage it in some places at some times with considerable skill, but manage is the word. Not defeat, not eliminate. Perhaps that is as it should be. Perhaps the goal was never elimination, because the aphid, after all, is part of the same web of life that sustains us. The predators that control it, the plants that fight it, the complex ecosystem interactions that keep it in balance, these are all part of the same fabric that ultimately produces the food on our tables. The question is not how to destroy the aphid. The question is how to live alongside it, intelligently, carefully, with enough respect for the complexity of the system to avoid the blunt mistakes of the past. The next time you hold a piece of bread in your hands, think about this. That bread began as a seed pressed into soil somewhere. It grew into a plant that faced wind and drought and disease and cold. And at some point during that growth, almost certainly, it faced aphids. Perhaps a brief visitation that the plant's own defenses and the field's predator population handled quietly and invisibly. Perhaps a serious infestation that a farmer found on a morning walk and spent days deciding how to manage. The grain made it through. Someone harvested it, milled it, baked it, and it arrived in your hands. Every loaf of bread carries within it the invisible history of that contest, the aphid and the plant, the predator and the prey, the farmer and the field. Every ear of corn, every apple, every cup of rice. All of it the product of a system so complex and so ancient that we are still, honestly, only beginning to understand it. The tiny insect that can destroy an entire farm has been shaping the story of food since long before humans grew their first crop. It will be shaping it long after us. And perhaps, knowing that we are part of something so much larger and longer than ourselves, the most useful thing we can do is approach it with a little more humility, a little more patience, and a great deal more respect for the world we are trying to feed ourselves from. That, in the end, is not just the lesson of the aphid. It is the lesson of the farm,